for the invitation to speak to you all today. Um, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. It's where my group spends most of our time working with monitoring technologies for dairy cattle. And we have had a lot of various experiences over the last 9 years in this area. And some of them have been really good and some of them not so good. Um, and my goal when I talk about this area is to kind of give an overview of what's coming along and what's here now. And I think there's some really neat, exciting things to look into, but also to give a reality check for what can work, what we need to be thinking about, and actually implementing these technologies on farm. So I spend quite a bit of my time toward the end talking about that. This area of precision dairy monitoring, basically what we're talking about is measuring various parameters or variables on the same animal across time. And we're measuring things perhaps in the milk, something behaviorally, something with the physiology of the animal, or it could be something with the conformation of the animal. And in general, we're measuring the same variable on the same animal across time and sort of using management by exception to look for deviations and say something like, this cow, her somatic cell count is normally here, but now it's really high. There's an alert that tells us it's high, and then we make a decision as a manager as to what to do about that. And so when I look at the cow, I think, what could we measure on that cow? And if you look at the image here, you'll see a lot of various variables that we could measure on an individual animal. And I'm sure it doesn't take much imagination to think of a few more. I'm probably one of only few people that when they go to the technology stores like Best Buy, that I go to the wearable technology aisle and look for technologies and think, where can I put this on a cow? There are lots of technologies that are out now, more coming along to measure some of the things that are on the slide here. There are questions, of course, about if we can measure these variables, then which ones should we measure? And I think if you look at that, you could say, well, if I was going to measure all those things, how much would it cost me to be able to do that? And I think the answer is too much. It would cost more than what we can afford to spend on an individual animal to measure all these different variables on the same cow. And we here at the University of Kentucky get close to measuring all those things on the same cow. And I can assure you that the value of the technologies on any one of our cows is more than the value of that cow. But that's for research. We can't do that, I think, in a commercial setting in a practical way. So the idea then is we can have this kind of a dashboard for an animal that shows all these variables that may indicate ones that are within a normal range or those that are in an outlying range. So we could know a whole lot of information about each individual animal within the herd. What are the potential applications for precision dairy monitoring? The most obvious and the most adopted thus far is estrus detection. Estrus detection has been around now for quite a few years, and these technologies, I think in general, do a really nice job of picking up when cows are in heat. It's actually fairly easy to do that because when a cow's in heat, we have a baseline activity level and we get a huge difference on the day that cow's in heat, and then it goes back to normal. The other thing that makes estrus detection a little bit easier than some of the other areas is that we know exactly what to do when we do catch that cow in heat. But we could also use these technologies for mastitis detection, fresh cow disease detection, lameness detection, possibly calving detection. I think these technologies provide us opportunities to get some new genetic traits. They bring in some variables that perhaps before we didn't have the ability to add to genetic evaluations because we didn't have a way of measuring them. So we talk about automated body condition scoring, for example. There are definitely genetic differences in how cows manage the body condition score curve within the lactation. And so we could start using those numbers to breed for animals that are built to not lose much body condition in early lactation. And then beyond the individual animal aspect, we also can use these technologies for monitoring things at the group level or at the cow or at the herd level, to see how we're doing for lying time at the herd level, for example. I think there are a lot of potential benefits for precision dairy. We can have improved animal health and animal well-being. We can detect perhaps diseases sooner than what we could without the technologies, improve our efficiencies, and improve our product quality, reduce the environmental impact of the dairy. And these technologies give us some more objective measures of things that we've typically done subjectively, like body condition scoring or locomotion scoring. In theory, if we are able to detect the disease earlier, then we can use that information to treat the animal earlier, which hopefully would help improve the outcome of the treatment, which would reduce production losses, economic losses, and improved animal well-being. If I look at this from a farm level, it's quite overwhelming. It's really overwhelming how many technologies are out there on the market today and how many more keep coming out. There's a new one every month or so, it seems like. And that's good in a way, but it makes it very confusing. If a farmer comes to the point and says, I want to adopt a technology, which one should I adopt? And I don't think it's a cookie cutter answer that says this is always the one that you should adopt, or this is always the variable that we should measure. I think it very much is farm dependent. It depends on where the opportunities for improving things are on that particular farm. So let's take a herd that's using a really good estrus synchronization program that has a 30% pregnancy rate. They're probably not going to benefit as much from an estrus detection system as another herd that perhaps is struggling a little bit more with reproductive management. So we have to make sure that we fit the technology with the needs of that particular farm. Like I said, we've worked with a lot of technologies, and these are the things that I look for in technologies. First of all, the technology has to explain some kind of a biological process. It needs to explain something that's going on with that animal. But not only that, whatever it tells us, we need to be able to translate that into a meaningful action. Just because I have a piece of information doesn't mean I can do something with it. So I need to have something that I can take that information and do something. If I have this change in activity, I know it's time to breed the cow, that sort of a thing. The technologies have to be cost effective. The price tag for some of these technologies can get pretty high pretty quickly. They have to be flexible, they have to be robust, and they have to be reliable. It's a very difficult environment that we ask these technologies to survive in. We have these big, clumsy animals that are working in wet, dirty environments. The technologies have to be simple, and I think they have to be solution focused. What I mean by that is I want a technology that the question started at the cow and moved toward the technology. We have issues sometimes with estrus detection. How could we work with that? Well, let's look if we can get something that can measure activity, as opposed to starting with the technology and moving toward the cow. I want the cow, I want the farmer kind of driving that decision as opposed to the engineer. And then lastly, I think that the information has to be provided in a readily available, easy to use, easy to understand format. Nobody has time on a 100 cow dairy or 1,000 cow dairy to look through graphs for every single animal every day. I need something that's going to refine that to where I have a very specific subset of animals that I need to be looking at for a particular day. So let's look at some of the different options. We'll start in the milking parlor. And one of the most exciting areas that I think we have there is inline somatic cell count. We have various devices that are used perhaps mostly thus far in robotic milking systems, but also opportunities in conventional parlors. It's really neat to think about this from a mastitis management perspective of being able to have this somatic cell count data every single milking. But also I think this is a point where we have to say, now if I have that information, what am I going to do with it? Let's say we have a cow that's going along at 100,000 somatic cell count, and then suddenly she pops up with a 2 million somatic cell count. What should be my decision for that animal? the first reaction would be, let's go treat that cow. But sometimes that cow that suddenly comes up to a 2 million somatic cell count, her body takes care of it. She rolls on, and we don't even notice it in the current systems because we're not looking for it. So I think we had to be really cautious here in our decisions with how to use this information, because there really is a risk that we could actually overtreat with these kinds of systems. We also have technologies that use spectroscopy. Basically, spectroscopy is looking at the pattern of light that's flowing through milk. These technologies are able to measure fat, protein, and lactose in line. So we get fat, protein, and lactose percentages for each animal, each milking. The fat and protein, I think, can be quite useful for looking at ketosis, for looking at acidosis, and lactose could be used for mastitis detection. So some neat opportunities there. The neat thing about this kind of a system is that there are no variable costs associated with using it, because there's no reagents or anything involved. You have the device, and then it keeps going from there. On the other hand, we have this kind of technology, the herd navigator, I think, is a really exciting technology. It measures progesterone in milk. And the progesterone we're getting physiologically at what actually is going on with that animal in terms of heat detection, potential for working with pregnancy detection, potential for helping this in managing cysts, for detecting abortions. I think progesterone is really, really an exciting variable to be measuring real time in our herds. This technology also measures the LDH enzyme, which is an early indicator of mastitis. And it measures BHBA, which is an early indicator, which is the indicator of subclinical ketosis. The nice thing about that is that in robotic milking herds, they can actually create a feedback loop to where that animal is actually provided the supplement in the robot as the cow's milking. So there's no intervention involved, and we kind of deal with BHBA problems, with subclinical ketosis problems very quickly, very proactively. There are a lot of analogies between what's going on in the cow world and what's going on within the human industry for wearable technologies. It's actually the same base technology that's in the Fitbit that's used in most of the technologies that we have on dairy farms. It's called an accelerometer. An accelerometer measures dimension in 3 dimensions. And so it's really pretty easy now when people ask, what do I do? I can tell them I work with Fitbits for cows. We have a lot of different technologies that sit on the cow's neck or sit in the ear. And here's some examples of those kinds of technologies. These technologies may be measuring activity. They can be measuring rumination time. They can be measuring eating time, grazing time, a lot of different potentials for these kinds of technologies. At first, when I heard this idea that we could put an ear tag on a cow or a neck tag on a cow and get rumination time and feeding time, I really thought, that's a crazy idea. How can we do that? Well, if you really watch cows and you watch them ruminate, you watch them eat, it's a very consistent motion that's occurring there. And these technologies just work on detecting that motion. And we validated some of these technologies, and they really do a nice job of picking up on things like rumination time and eating time. We also could measure the physiology of the animal. The most common thing that we would see measured is temperature. We have various locations where we could measure temperature. There are quite a few different technologies on the market for measuring rumen temperature. Rumen temperature is a nice place to measure temperature, but the problem is every time that cow drinks water, there's a dramatic decrease in the rumen temperature. But how we manage that data, how we work out that data is a bit complicated, because it takes almost 2 to 3 hours in some cases for that temperature to return back to normal. We could measure temperature in the vagina, but we can't do that for very long because it creates infections. There's also the idea that we would use this kind of an ear probe that you see on the upper right of this slide. where we could get into the ear canal. It's a great temperature for the animal. The problem that we've had when using these kind of devices is the cows don't necessarily like a probe in their ear, so they work pretty hard to get that probe out. There are also technologies that measure room pH, and room pH, of course, being useful for acidosis detection and managing acidosis probably more at the group level or the farm level. This is a technology that's probably not quite ready for farms yet, as it's still, I think, a little bit too pricey to be able to put onto a farm. Then we have the vet check system, which is looking at respiration rate, heart rate, blood pressure. Not really something that's on commercial farms yet, but could be at some point in the future. There are quite a few different technologies that measure lying time. So lying time can be a very useful variable for determining cow comfort, for identifying animals that need attention. Maybe lame cows lay down more, sick cows lay down more or less. Estrus cows, they probably lay down quite a bit less. Probably a little bit confusing because some lame cows lay down more, some lame cows lay down less. Some cows with mastitis lay down more, some cows with mastitis lay down less. So that makes it difficult sometimes to interpret some of this information. Then we have real-time location systems. So these technologies are basically identifying where the animal is within the barn, and they give us an XY coordinate for every animal. In the case of the one that we use here at the university, the SmartBow system, we get an XY coordinate for every cow every second. I probably don't actually care to know exactly where every cow is every second, but where I think this information can be useful is in determining where cows spend their time and looking at time budgets, looking at how much time the cow spends resting, how much time the cow spends at the feed pump, how much time the cow spends in the alleys. Using that information to determine how we optimally manage the herd, manage the groups of animals, but also in how we can look for deviations that may indicate something odd is going on with a particular animal. The other area where I think these can be useful down the line is putting them in feedback loops to where we're able to use this information to determine what areas of the barn to turn fans on, sprinklers on, that sort of thing. There are a few devices on the market now for looking at calving detection. We have some examples here. The one on the top left is the Madria device. This is looking at vaginal temperature. The one on the bottom right also is vaginal temperature. The other two are devices that are put onto the tail. They're looking at motion of the tail. We've done quite a bit of work. You can see here's our cow with lots of gadgets on her. We put technologies, as I said, all over that animal to compare within the same animals, which of these technologies tell us more about mastitis or fresh cow disease or lameness, for example. So we're doing these kind of comparisons to try to learn more about what these technologies might actually be able to tell us. These are examples of some of the various leg devices that we've used. Here's some of the ear devices that we've used, and then some of the neck devices that we've used. We also have worked in the rumen with both temperature and pH. And here's these calving detection devices. Again, we've worked with both of these. So the temperature idea is actually kind of interesting. There is a dramatic drop in temperature that occurs 24 to 48 hours before calving. And that's what we're picking up with this device. It gives us an alert saying this cow is going to calve sometime within the next 24 to 48 hours. The device on the tail, though, is looking at motion, and it's basically looking for the motion of the cow raising her tail up and down, and it really a pretty good indicator of when that cow is going to calve. The problem with that is that these devices, we have to be careful on not getting them too tight, or we may accidentally dock the tail, and if we get them too loose, then they'll fall off. So they recommend that we only leave that device on for 4 days, which I think is potentially a practical disadvantage. Then we worked some with systems in the parlor. and some of the image-based systems, for example, the DeLaval body condition scoring system. We've also done a little bit of work in new technology development. Here's kind of the basic concept for looking at body condition score. We're looking at a cow from above and getting a contour of that cow so that we can look at the angles around the hooks, around the pins, around the spine, and use that information to determine body condition score. And the neat thing is this is being done with basically the same camera that's in the Xbox. We also had an idea at one point and published a paper looking at feed intake, basically using 3D imaging. So we take a camera, put it over the bunk, and look at the disappearance of feed based on the contour of that feed. So we have, for example, in the middle on the top, that's a full bin of feed, and the one below is one where the cow would have eaten out of it. And you just look at the difference to determine what the intake actually was. Then we've looked a little bit at sleep. There's not a lot of work that's been done on sleep in dairy cattle, but I think it's an interesting area related to cow comfort. We did it because we started seeing cows sleeping more in compost-bedded pack barns, and we have a lot of those here in Kentucky, and we've also done a lot of research with compost-bedded pack barns. I think it could be really important to understanding immunity. We know that when we're not getting enough quality rest, that we're more likely to get sick, and there could be some similarities with cows. So we put this monitor on the cow's neck, and we're able to identify sleep fairly well with that particular tag. We've also worked with technology validation. Here are some of the technologies that we worked with in one study where we had tags on the legs and the neck of the animal, and here's the results from that. This basically shows that we looked at 3 different tags. All of them were essentially perfect for looking at lying behavior, for feeding behavior. We also looked at a couple of tags. Both of them were really good for that. However, for rumination time, one of the tags we looked at was really good, and one of them was just a little bit better than okay. We were able to validate that the real-time location system really did tell us where the cow was within a meter. We looked at estrus detection also, and one of the studies that we did with estrus detection, we had about 110 cows on that study. We used a modified G7G program, and we left the last GnRH shot off of that, and then we looked for estrus. We looked for luteal regression and ovulation, looking at the progesterone patterns to determine which cows were in heat. And then we also came in and spread throughout the day. We visually looked for cows in heat 4 times a day for 30 minutes each. So we were spending 2 hours a day for visual estrus detection. And then these cows had 9 different technologies on them. Here's what we found. This is basically looking at the percentage of cows that the technology detected in heat that were actually physiologically in heat. And you can see, with one exception, these technologies were all about 80% accurate. The one device that was lower is not available in the US, so no need to worry about that. They all did a really nice job of picking up when cows were in heat. And if you look, compared to us looking at standing time, they all were about 25 to 30% better than what we were. So even looking at 4 times a day, these technologies did a better job detecting cows in heat. We spend a lot of time looking at disease status. And we can look, for example, at something like this where we say, here's the changes in variables around disease. So we have a decrease in rumination time, a decrease in activity and milk yield, and an increase in temperature around mastitis, for example. Also, to look at this and say, we do have a decrease in temperature associated with subclinical hypocalcemia, so that cold ear effect that we would be looking for with milk fever. And we're able to show that as we look across the early lactation period, there is a difference in the ratio of fat to protein for cows with and without subclinical ketosis. There's a big difference in milk yield for cows with and without subclinical milk fever, and a big difference in time at the feed bunk for cows with and without subclinical milk fever. So these all show the potential for using these variables for detection of various conditions. Like I mentioned, we've done some calving detection work. Here's that pattern that occurs: a slight increase in temperature followed by a dramatic decrease in temperature right about 24 to 48 hours before calving. Unfortunately, in the end, from this study, the device wasn't quite as accurate as we'd like for it to have been. In about 60% of the cases, the alert was within 48 hours before the bolus came out of the animal, but only 10% of the time, there was no alert provided at all. And then 32% of the time, the alert was well before 48 hours before it came out. So still some room for growth there, some room for improvements with that in identifying when cows are going to calve. We were interested, could we take some of the technologies that we already use for other things, like the HR tag, which measures rumination, or the ice cube, which measures line time, and use those to detect when the cow's going to calve. And in fact, when we took this in the data set within our herd, we were able to get really good results with trying to detect when the cow's going to calve with these existing technologies. I think there are also a lot of management applications. So I really think there's a lot of potential for using these technologies for within group or within herd changes. Saying there's a change in rumination time from where we have been today, for example. I think they can be useful for cohort comparisons, but we always need to remember we have to keep in natural variation and lag. Body condition score, for example, is a lagging variable. What we see today is a result of a period of time before today. And then we also have, for example, if we have a change in 15 minutes a day of rumination time, we need to not push the panic button. That's probably just within the range of normal variation. While I do think these variables are useful for within group, I think we have to be really cautious with how we use this data for comparing across herds. There are different conditions that affect these variables within different herds. Even just how the tag is tight or loose on the cow can have an impact on the results. So we have to be really careful in not saying, my rumination time is 500 minutes a day, yours is 600 minutes a day, I'm not as good as you, how do I get there? I don't think it's that clear cut, at least not at this point. And we need to question conventional wisdom for some. For example, we talk about cows that lie down more milk more, but if we look within the herd, the cows that are lying down the most are cows that milk the least, and vice versa. So we have to keep in mind that within a herd, that's probably true, but across herds, within a herd, that relationship is not really there, but across herds it is. We do have to keep a balance between all this technological transformation and some of the challenges. I really like this graph that kind of describes what happens as somebody starts thinking about a new technology. We have a technology trigger. This is something that tells us, here's this new technology. We get excited about it. We enter this peak of inflated expectations. And then after that, we go into the trough of disillusionment. This is basically the point where we're frustrated. We don't understand why it didn't do what we thought it was going to do. And then we move into a more productive period with that. So I think with estrus detection, I think we've already been through the inflated expectations. We've figured out things like an estrus detection technology won't catch a cow that's not actually in heat. And we're out in this plateau of productivity. For health detection, though, I think in many ways we're probably in the peak of inflated expectations. This is not too far off from what our herdsman's office looks like at our university dairy. We have all these different software programs managing these different systems. Most of them won't talk to each other. They won't talk to our management software. So we get into this scenario where we have too much data in different places, which makes decision-making with the data a lot harder. So I think this is one of our huge challenges as an industry, is learning how we can integrate this data together to get the full value out of it. Now, this is one of the sort of warning points in looking at these technologies. This is sort of a marketing approach where we say, here we have a cow, she's going along averaging 7 or 8 hours a day lying time, and then all of a sudden she increases to over 10 hours a day, and we say this cow had mastitis. So if we look at that, we might draw the conclusion that this particular variable lying time would be useful for mastitis detection. But that's not the whole story. We have to ask these two questions. If I have 100 estrus events and 80 of them the technology identifies, but 20 of them it misses, is that good enough? That's what we would call 80% sensitivity. The flip side of that question is if I have 100 alerts telling me this cow's in heat, how many of those alerts are correct? If 90 of them are for cows that are actually in heat and 10 are for cows that are not in heat, that's a 90% specificity. The problem is both of these numbers are always in conflict with each other. So if we get a higher sensitivity, we tend to lower our specificity. If we get a higher specificity, we tend to lower our sensitivity. I can make any technology we have pick up every cow with estrus just by lowering the standard. But when I do that, I get more false positives. Also, as we look at this, this is some data from a couple of cows in one of the herds we worked with in a commercial study. The pink bars represent times when the system gave an alert. The blue stars indicate when a disease was actually identified. So if we go across here, we can see here's a match. We have a cow with metritis, and the technology told us she would have it. But then here we have an alert with nothing going on. Here we have an alert that's not really something we needed to know about. We did a hoof trimming event. Here's an alert with nothing, alert with nothing. Here we got mastitis before mastitis. That's good. Then we come out here though, and we have an alert that's the alert occurs after we've identified, after our milkers have identified that case of mastitis. Same concept here, but the bottom line is look at all these pink lines where we had alerts with nothing going on with that animal. So I think this can be very frustrating from a farmer perspective because you get this list of cows. It's 20 cows out of your 100 cow herd. Where do I go? Which ones should I look at? It's not clear cut, and I'd really like to see that list a little bit more refined than that. Some other questions that we have are with things like how do we handle the data? What are we going to do about alerts, repeat alerts? What about natural reactions of healthy cows, like the somatic cell count example I talked about earlier? What do we do with failed devices? They do fail, some of them more frequently than others. Do we have a backup plan for a system outage? If lightning strikes and our system's down, what are we going to do for that next couple of days until it can be fixed? And then I think this will be an increasingly important issue over time is data security and ownership. Who owns the data? The farmer? Does the company own the data? It's not always clear there, and I think that we'll see some conflicts of this coming up. This is my friend David Corbin. David is a really good dairyman here in Kentucky. He is one of the most pure cow husbandry people I've ever met. Excellent manager. A few years ago, we were looking for herds to participate on a study with us. I suggested that David would be good. The company suggested that this was a really bad idea. After they met them, they thought he would never figure out how to use it. He couldn't really use a computer mouse much before, but now he's super user because he understands cows and he relates the data that he's looking at back to the cows, and he looks at the cows and then goes back and looks at the data. So here's somebody that really has the great cow husbandry skills, and these are the people that are going to benefit the most from technologies. If we're just looking for an easy way out for something we don't like to do, we're probably likely going to not be successful. Probably our biggest contribution to the field of animal sciences is learning that Cat5 cable is a raccoon delicacy. Our raccoons have chewed up so many wires and messed things up. These are not things that you typically hear what related to technologies. It's not in the manual what to do when we have a raccoon in the barn, but I think they're really important to think about because we do have these biological risks on our farm. Also, although they say that lightning will not strike the same place twice, I can assure you it will strike the same technology twice. Lightning is also a big limitation for us. I think there are a few questions that everybody should ask if they're thinking about investing in the technology. First of all, what are the sensitivity and specificity for whatever condition you're looking at? That's estrus, mastitis, whatever. What percentage of the devices fail per year? What's the warranty policy? What's the policy for upgrading to new versions of devices? If there's a new device, how long do I have to wait before I can get that onto my operation? And do I have to start all over, or can I just have an upgrade fee since I'm already part of the system? We need to make sure we capture all the full costs. We want to make sure we capture any hardware, devices, maintenance, data storage, etc., that's associated with using these technologies. And lastly, I really think it would be nice if we had a protocol that helped us know how we handle these alerts. If we see this scenario, here's what we do. If we see this scenario, here's what you go look for. That sort of thing I think would help tremendously. Where are we going to from here? I think we'll continue to see more sensor-based systems, more wearable technologies. But I think at the same time, a higher percentage of the new technologies will be looking at milk or images to assess something within that animal. We'll use newer technology, newer statistical or semi-statistical techniques like neural networks and fuzzy logic to pick up on cows. Basically, these techniques try to mimic the way that our brains think. We can look, I think, for individual farm algorithms. I think it's a little bit funny that we assume that there's a 30% increase in variable X without knowing what's going on that particular farm, because if we have a farm that's going out to pasture, their activity is going to look very different than those that are indoors all the time. I think we'll see more user groups, more chances where farmers can get together, talk to each other, learn from each other about how to use these technologies. And I think we'll see an increased demand for better alerts for these technologies. So big data, you hear that term a lot. It's here, it's part of the dairy industry now. There are some really exciting opportunities with this data, but we have to maintain realistic expectations with how we manage these technologies. You can see here is my contact information. Also, there's Precision Patty. She is our blue and white cow that showcases all of our technologies. Patty she's active in social media. She has a Twitter account, a Facebook account, and a LinkedIn account. So if you're interested in learning more about this area, I encourage you to go look that information up and like those pages so that you can see updates about them. And then also, we are hosting the national meeting on precision dairy here in Lexington, Kentucky from May 30th to June 1st. All that information is online if you just search Precision Dairy 2017. We hope some of you will think about coming down for that.